The Context of 1962 War. By Amiya Kumar Ghosh. The discussions on the boundary issue between China and India as it evolved in the 1950s and 1960s can be divided into three sectors: the western sector running from Karakoram Pass to Demchok on the Indus, the middle sector, running from there to the Nepal boundary and covering, on the Indian side, Uttar Pradesh, up, and Himachal Pradesh, and the eastern sector, running from Bhutan to Burma, Myanmar, which is covered by the McMahon Line. One cannot understand the basis of the discussions or the directions they took, without being familiar with the outline of history of the boundary question, nor can one speculate about the direction it should take in future. When we talk of a boundary, we talk of a line marking the limits of an area. Frontier refers to areas along a border separating two countries. Put differently, it constitutes an area of separation between two regions of more or less homogeneous population. Boundaries shown as lines on maps represent edges of frontiers. Demarcation, another word we come across, means construction of boundary markers in the landscape. Delimitation means selecting a boundary site and its definition, followed up by an agreement between two parties. Differences in the connotation of the words are to be noted to understand some important aspects of the Sino-Indian border dispute. Zhou Enlai, the Prime Minister of China, in his letter dated January 23, 1959, to Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, used the concept of delimitation and stated, "First of all, I wish to point out that the Sino-Indian boundary has never been formally delimited. Historically, no treaty and agreement on the Sino-Indian boundary has been concluded between the Chinese central government and the Indian government." He subsequently adds, "Precisely because the boundary between the two countries is not yet formally delimited and differences exist, it is unavoidable that there should be discrepancies between the boundary lines drawn on the respective maps of the two sides." Nehru used the word frontier in his reply dated March 22, 1959. On receipt of your letter, I have again examined the basis of the determination of the frontier between India and Tibet region of China. It is true that this frontier has not been demarcated on the ground in all sectors, but I am somewhat surprised to know that the frontier has not been accepted any time by the government of China. The traditional frontier, as you may be aware, follows the geographical principle of the watershed on the crest of the high Himalayan range, but apart from this, in most parts, it has the sanction of a specific international agreement between the government of India and the central government of China. Regarding the Ladakh boundary in the western sector, he referred a treaty of 1842 between Kashmir and Lhasa. Regarding the eastern sector, reference was made to the McMahon Line, which emerged out of the tripartite conference held in Simla in 1913-14. Nehru added, "Although the Chinese plenipotentiary at the conference objected to the boundaries between Inner and Outer Tibet and between Tibet and China, there is no mention of any Chinese reservation in respect of the Indo-Tibet frontier either during the discussion or at the time of initialing the convention. This line has the incidental advantage of running along the crest of the high Himalayan range, which forms the natural dividing line between the Tibetan plateau in the north and the sub-mountain region in the south." By the end of 1950, the Indian administration decided to treat the McMahon Line as the boundary in the eastern sector, which was not to be submitted to any negotiation with China. This was a major step in policy making regarding the eastern sector. In reply to a question in the Lok Sabha in November 1950, Prime Minister Nehru said, "The frontier from Bhutan eastwards had been clearly defined by the McMahon Line, which was fixed by the Simla Convention of 1914. The frontier from Ladakh to Nepal is defined chiefly by long usage and custom." To stress that the McMahon Line was not open to negotiation, Nehru further stated, "Our maps show that the McMahon Line is our boundary, and that is our boundary map or no map." The basic difference between the eastern and western sectors of the boundary which comes out from the above statements is that, in one case, it defined by a boundary line, while in the other, it is defined chiefly by long usage and custom. usage and custom is always the subject of interpretation. Till 1958 in the discussions between the two prime ministers, while reference was made to the McMahon Line, no boundary issue was discussed about the western sector. India was reluctant to raise the boundary issues, almost as a policy, leaving it to China to raise it. To get a proper perspective on the boundary in the eastern sector, one has to refer to the relevant provisions of the Simla Convention of 1914 among Great Britain, China, and Tibet. A conference was called in Simla by Great Britain in 1913-14. China and Tibet were invited to the conference as equal participants and China participated on that basis. The outcome of it was the Simla Convention of July 3, 1914. Whereas the Simla Convention itself, after being initialed by the Chinese plenipotentiary, was not signed or ratified by the Chinese government, it was accepted as binding by the two other parties as between themselves. Article 2 of the convention reads as follows. The governments of Great Britain and China, recognizing that Tibet is under the suzerainty of China and recognizing also the autonomy of Outer Tibet, engage to respect the territorial integrity of the country, and to abstain from interference in the administration of Outer Tibet, including the selection and installation of the Dalai Lama, which shall remain in the bands of the Tibetan government at Lhasa. The government of China engages not to convert Tibet into a Chinese province. The government of Great Britain engages not to annex Tibet or any portion of it. The extract of Article 9 of the Convention, which is relevant for the border issue, reads as follows. For the purpose of the present Convention, the borders of Tibet, and the boundary between Outer and Inner Tibet, shall be shown in red and blue on the map attached hereto. It may be added that, earlier, an agreement of March 1914 had laid down in clear terms the Indo-Tibetan boundary in a map to define the 850 miles of their boundary. The map defined the boundary from the Azarazi Pass in Burma, westward till it reached Bhutan. The line was not defined in the text. It was defined solely on the agreed map which was attached to the convention. This map was initialed by the British representatives and by the Chinese and Tibetan representatives on April 27, 1914. Later, the British representative and Tibetan representative put their signatures. So, in effect, it became a bilateral agreement between India and Tibet. As far as available records show, Ivan Chen, the Chinese representative, though aware about the talks and outcome, did not at any time complain about the bilateral agreement. In Delhi, as in Whitehall, the Simla Convention and McMahon Line were soon forgotten as World War I broke out. As Parsatam Mehta points out, the convention was all but forgotten, and significantly, Delhi's compendium of treaties, engagement and sanads, the redoubtable Aitchison volumes in their 1928 edition, made no mention of it. Nor for that matter, did the Survey of India etch the McMahon contours on its maps. In 1935, the Foreign and Political Department suddenly woke up about the frontier with Tibet, partly due to the travels of W. F. Kingdon Ward, the botanist who traversed Monial in Balipara and raised critical points in this regard. After various consultations, New Delhi categorically informed the governor of Assam in February 1936 that it was clear that the whole of hill country up to 1914 McMahon Line is within the frontier of India. Soon thereafter, London was told that it would be of advantage to insert in their published record copies of the 1914 convention and the exchange of notes between Sir Henry McMahon and the Tibetan government. New Delhi took immediate steps for showing the international frontier in this sector in the Survey of India Maps, and revised edition of Volume 14 of Atchison v. Treaties was to be published. As A. G. Noorani points out, refusal to sign the 1914 convention by the Chinese representative does not entitle China to question this boundary for two incontestable reasons. First, it was aware of the map and did not object to it. The law of estoppel debars it from questioning the line thereafter. All the more so when, secondly, its every single objection then and thereafter consistently was to the line dividing Inner and Outer Tibet, never to the boundary between India and Tibet. The challenge to the McMahon Line was mounted much later, in the 30s. The Chinese position regarding the McMahon Line has not been consistent. Their challenge was dropped in 1954-55, revived in 1959, more stridently in 1979, and pursued with increasing pertinacity since 1990s, with the focus on Tawang. What about Tawang? One needs to go into this issue because the Chinese claim about this area has been repeated in recent years. One thing is clear, that whatever the Chinese may claim in regard to Tawang, it is in the south of the McMahon Line. As mentioned above, China challenged the McMahon Line only in the mid-1930s. The Indian government, till the eve of Indian independence, treated the McMahon Line as the settled boundary and did not accept any encroachment on and across it. In October 1936, Basil Gould, political officer in Sikkim, was sent to Lhasa and instructed to leave the Tibetans in no doubt that the objections of the government of India were not only to the encroachments in the Tawang area but in any part of India to the south of the McMahon Line. As Noorani points out, this is crucial. India regarded the McMahon Line as the settled boundary. It matters not that it permitted it to occupy Tawang, still less that in the internal debates, some officials advocated a frontier to the south. Nor the fact that for its own reasons, London preferred not to protest to Nanking. Explaining Tibet's interest in Tawang and New Delhi's difficulty, Parsitam Mehta writes, New Delhi's major difficulty arose from Lhasa's refusal to withdraw its tax gatherers, euphemistically called administrators for. Other things apart, rack-renting the Munbas was a most lucrative proposition. There was also the Raj's typical Banian mentality. For Twainam, the acting governor of Assam in 1939, computed that making a frontier on the Sela and the Dijian River would cost almost a quarter of what the Tawang alignment would. A note of the External Affairs Department of the Government of India, prepared in March 1946 on the tribes of northwest and northeast frontiers in a future constitution, reveals the Government of India's perception of the boundary on the eve of independence. In the McMahon Line area, the factors recognized were, I. Existence of an external boundary with a foreign state. 2. The fact that penetration of the area was still in the early stages. The penetration of the area with a view to establish the validity of the McMahon Line as the frontier of India was a task beyond the provincial capacity and has had to be undertaken under arrangements made by the central government. The task involves much expenditure, and since it is essentially a matter of vindicating the external frontier of India, it follows that it is one to be handled by a central and not by a provincial authority, more particularly since Tibetan penetration of the area has already gone some distance. The latter fact becomes all the more necessary if present Chinese determination to reabsorb Tibet as a province of China succeeds. This makes it very clear that the government of India, on the eve of Indian independence, had not only no doubt about, but reaffirmed, that the McMahon Line defined the boundary in the eastern sector. It also underlined the necessity of taking the administration right up to the boundary as a precautionary measure against an expansionist China. It may be mentioned that the nationalist Chinese in 1948 had pointed out to the government of India that the Simla Convention and its products were invalid. According to Neville Maxwell, after the communist takeover of China, their main concern became a liberation of Tibet, and by 1951, the concepts of inner line and outer line of Tibet, as spelt out in 1914's similar agreement, became redundant. But the issue of recognition by China of the McMahon Line dividing the boundary between India and Tibet emerging out of parleys between Tibet and India, came to be raised only in 1956, when Chu Enlai visited India. Regarding the McMahon Line, A. G. Noorani comments, thus, was a boundary defined, nearly a century ago. A line was drawn on a map of a mountainous tribal region, by a thick nib dipped in red ink which applied on the ground, will yield surprising results. He feels that it allows room for adjustment and compromise. Whether it allows room for adjustment and compromise is another question depending on the relations between two nations and whether it leads to joint surveys in disputed areas. But it can be only a few miles here and there on either side of the boundary. The map was on the scale of 8 miles to the inch. For extension of regular Indian administration in the Tawang area, one had to wait till February 1951 when Bob Kating, an Indian Frontier Service officer, and his forces established effective control, setting aside all ambivalence in various circles of the government. This was not too soon, as towards the end of 1950, the Chinese army marched into Tibet with a view to what they described as the liberation of Tibet, and the government of India looked on helplessly. Nehru, in a statement in the Lok Sabha on December 7, 1950, reacting to the developments in Tibet and the Chinese claim about liberating Tibet, stated, "From whom they are going to liberate Tibet is, however, not quite clear." He also expressed shock that Chinese armies were marching into Tibet when it was no threat to China. It is, therefore, no surprise that when India rightfully extended its regular administration in the Tawang area in February 1951, China kept quiet about it as its hands were full in liberating Tibet. It can also validly be interpreted as Chinese acceptance of the McMahon Line at that time. The later Chinese claim that the Tibetans protested vigorously about the extension of Indian administration in Tawang in 1951, was contradicted by the Indian team in the 1961 official's report. Neville Maxwell, in an article in the China Quarterly, July 1970, which dealt with Tawang, stated that Tibet continued to be in possession of the Tawang monastery till 1952, with probably the implication that Tibet administered the Tawang area through the Tawang monastery. As T. Smrti points out, it was the Sero monastery and not the Tibetan government, which concerned itself with the Tawang monastery, and further, according to the 1960 report, China herself does not claim that the Munpan area in general, or the Tawang Valley, in particular, was administered by the monastery. The main point, which Maxwell ignores, is that no evidence has been put forward that the Tawang monastery was in the possession of the Tibetan government, and not affiliated for some purposes to a Tibetan monastery. Tawang area. The Tawang subdivision has an area of 805 square miles, is inhabited by the Munpa tribe. They are not Tibetans. There is a distinct difference in the dialects spoken by Tibetan villagers adjoining the McMahon Line and those of the Munpas. 19 Administration of the area earlier, before February 1951, had been carried out by the Munpa chiefs. The Tibetan government concerned itself with the Tawang monastery only to the extent that its religious works and the allotment of revenues from its estates in the Trans-Himalayan areas needed attention. The executive authority of the monastery was in the hands of an elected council and not the representatives of the Tibetan government. 20 Murty also refers to an agreement between the East India Company and Tawang Monastery, which was reiterated in a separate agreement signed in 1853 with its representatives and various Munpa chiefs, one of its obligations being attendance at the annual Darbar held by the Deputy Commissioner of Darang District, and subsequently the political officer, Balipara, Bomdla. What is crucial, as stated above, is that the government of India, on the eve of India's independence, regarded the McMahon Line as a settled boundary, and Tawang was clearly within that boundary, and the fact that they permitted some Tibetans to occupy it, did not matter at all. There is also the issue of defining of the boundary in the western sector, as also of demarcation. As Karunakar Gupta points out, the Survey of India maps published in Free India during 1947 to 1952 depicted the northeastern border of India, eastward from Bhutan, along the Himalayan high crest line as undemarcated, while the western sector and the middle sector of the northern border beginning from the northwestern end of Kashmir to the tri-junction of Nepal, Tibet, India were shown by a color wash with the words boundary undefined imprinted thrice along the stretch. Demarcation is tracing out on the ground or on a detailed map. It may involve exploring detailed geography of the boundary zone. It could be a process of arriving at an apportionment of territories in disputed area. This is more important in the western sector in the absence of a defined boundary. To quote from the report of the officials, 1961, at the 17th meeting, the Chinese side brought forward official Indian maps of 1865, 1903, 1917, 1929 and 1938 and said the boundary in the western sector has not been shown. It was true that the boundary had not been shown, but this did not in any way contradict the Indian position, which has established with a vast amount of evidence that a traditional and customary boundary existed, and that is well known. Even the Chinese side did not contend that there was no traditional and customary alignment at all, or that as late as 1938, a country like India had no international boundaries. These maps were obviously meant for internal circulation. There were, for example, a number of Chinese maps which did not show all the regions of China within China's external frontiers. The report goes on to add, the map of India and adjacent countries of 1945, and of India showing political divisions of 1950 carried the legend frontier undefined, but it had been explained in the Government of India's note of February 12 that this only indicated that the boundary had not been demarcated on the ground, or defined in detail from point to point. That there was no doubt about the limits of Indian territory was clear from the fact that both these maps carried a color wash right up to the traditional boundary. Whether a color wash could substitute for a defined boundary is another matter. There is also the issue of consensus on how a watershed is to be defined. During the Sino-Indian official level border talks of 1960, it was brought out that the Chinese delegation felt that a true watershed should be one which entirely excluded two adjacent drainage basins from each other. In case they were connected, it would cease to be a watershed. As Murty points, the Chinese view does seem to exclude from the purview of the term most mountain ranges till now regarded as watersheds, which may not be reasonable. What is essential is that water should flow in different directions. So, the issue of defining and demarcation of the border can be more complicated than drawing a line on a map. As put by T.S. Murty, who was advisor in the Indian officials team, it is not possible to say why a particular line is the boundary. If one is thinking of the boundary of Nafar, it is the boundary between Tawang and Tsna, the boundary between Kaloriang and Chayal, between Taxing and Lung, between Longu, Maja and Midjiatun, between Meshhuka and Gaza, between Tuting and Dangam, and between Hayoliang and Sangaklialing. There is no easy way out of ascertaining the validity of a frontier, and the only possible technique for the study of a boundary is to take it stretch by stretch, mile by mile, village by village and pasture by pasture, and determine where exactly the boundary line is in each stretch and each mile. As the demarcation of the border in the eastern sector was not done by the British till they left India, the issue remains. This need not have been viewed as a serious lacuna if India and China accepted each other's point of view and there were no conflicting claims on territory. If there are conflicting claims, then these are required to be resolved first through negotiation before demarcation is attempted. But the point regarding demarcation in the eastern sector needs to be noted, as this point continues to be raised by the Chinese authorities even today. It may be mentioned that Zhou Enlai did not raise any issue relating to demarcation of the border in the eastern sector during his discussions with Nehru in 1956, when he indicated his willingness to accept the McMahon Line as the border in the eastern sector subject to further discussions with the Tibetan authorities. This was presumably because the relations between the two countries were at that time good and India was considered a friendly country. In any case, if demarcation has to be attempted, it has to be a joint process. Towards the end of 1956, when Zhou Enlai visited India, the issue was raised by him, and Nehru quotes him as saying, "You told me then that you had accepted this McMahon Line border with Burma and, whatever might have happened long ago. In view of the friendly relations which existed between China and India, you proposed to recognize this border with India also." In reply, Zhou, in his letter dated January 23, 1959, regarding the McMahon Line, stated that though it was a product of British policy of aggression against Tibet, the Chinese government finds it necessary to take a more or less realistic attitude towards the McMahon Line. We believe that on account of friendly relations between China and India, a friendly settlement can eventually be found for this section of the boundary line. On August 23, 1959, in reply to a question in the Lok Sabha, Nehru stated, "We stick to the McMahon Line. But it is quite another thing that in this long line, there may be minor arguments about a mile here or mile there. These arguments were there before the Chinese came into Tibet. We admit these differences which exist and which should be settled. We think we are right, but let us sit around a concurrence table." In September 1959, Nehru told the Lok Sabha that, by and large, the McMahon Line was fixed, but in some parts, in Subansiri area or somewhere it was not considered a good line and it was varied afterwards by us, by the government of India. The Indian government refused to submit the McMahon Line as a whole to negotiation. It was at this time offering to discuss the exact alignment of the line at specific points. These offers were, as Maxwell comments, in the context of India's insistence not only that China should first formally recognize the McMahon Line but she should also accept the boundary India claimed in the western sector later. China was to agree to interim discussions on particular points in the dispute, but she required that such discussions be preliminary to comprehensive negotiations on the boundaries. The way even to interim discussions on marginal questions of alignment was, thus, blocked on both sides. But by insisting on the condition of comprehensive negotiations on the boundaries, the Chinese were making an unreasonable demand, which no self-respecting independent nation could accept. So the steps for a major conflict were being laid. It is not a question of reluctance to negotiate, but one has to understand what the negotiation involves. The existence of the McMahon Line could not prevent a major conflict in this sector in 1962, as relations between the two countries started deteriorating. Border clashes took place particularly in the western sector in 1958 as China was following a forward policy to claim as much territory as possible in an undefined border. Clashes led to acrimonious exchange of notes.